Welcome, everybody. My name is Ari Kelman. I'm on the faculty of the Graduate School of Education. I am also one of the core faculty of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk featuring Jeremiah Lockwood. So the first time I saw Jeremiah Lockwood, he was playing guitar in the Union Square subway station, and he was hard to miss. He was dressed much as he was today. In my memory, he was wearing a hat. The next time I saw Jeremiah Lockwood was not in a subway station, but it was in a conference of the Jewish Funders Network in Denver. We were in a posh conference room with a full view of the Rockies. And he performed some cantorial music mashed up with fingerstyle blues. And for a room full of middle-aged Jewish funders who expected Jewish music to sound like Debbie Friedman, which is to say sort of like folk music, he revealed a thing about Jewish music that they could not have imagined. Afterwards, I sheepishly asked him if he taught guitar lessons, and he said he did, but I never followed up. We ran into each other a number of times over the next few years, but the next serious conversation that we had was about the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, in which Jeremiah turned the tables and asked me if we were accepting PhD students, and he did follow up. So he came to study in the GSE and the Toby Center and brought with him all of this experience and knowledge about Jewish music of all kinds. He eventually focused his studies, which he'll talk about more today, on cantorial music. Now, cantorial music is not what comes to mind when people usually think of the Jewish musical avant-garde, and neither is it the sound of most American congregations. Yet Jeremiah heard in a small group of ultra-Orthodox cantors the sounds of something remarkable. By listening and singing, studying, transcribing, and practicing, Jeremiah tuned into a wavelength of Jewish religious and cultural production that challenges many of the taken for granted elements of prayer, music, creative expression, religion, and secularism. The book that I just learned has already come out on UC Press is a project that only Jeremiah could have undertaken and accomplished. Its roots could be found way back in that Denver conference room or in that subway station where his musical knowledge and his curiosity, his ability to confound, challenge, and clarify even blurred the distinctions between teachers and students. Presently, Jeremiah is a postdoctoral fellow at the Katz Center at University of Pennsylvania, having completed a previous postdoc at the Yale Institute for Sacred Music, where he was the first fellow to study Jewish music. He is a prolific blogger for UCLA's Milken Center for the Study of Jewish Music and a pioneering archivist of all things cantorial. It's my pleasure to welcome back to Stanford and introduce Jeremiah Lockwood.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you all so much for coming here, and I hope we'll have a chance to chat a little bit more after I speak. And okay, well, I'll get started then. And thank you so much to Ari for the kind introduction, and to Shana for facilitating this happening, and to all of you for being here, of course. So my book, Golden Ages, Hasidic Singers and Cantorial Revival in the Digital Era, which was published this month, developed out of my thesis research, a multi-year ethnography working with cantors in the Brooklyn Hasidic community. Starting from a point of interest in early 20th century styles of cantorial music, I found that there was an active interest in early 20th century styles of this very specific musical genre in the Hasidic community among a subculture of male singers who were studying khazones, which is the Yiddish term for cantorial art music, and developing careers that hinged on their expertise as interpreters of early cantorial records. So what surprised me about their work, beyond its very existence, was the fact that their choices about sacred music repertoire had profound implications for their lives as members of a separatist conservative community, offering a challenge to conceptions of authority and the arts in religious communities. My talk today will provide an introduction to my work with these imaginative explorers of the Jewish Music Archive, and also offer a hint of critique of my own findings. So after many years of research and writing, I am alive to the many possibilities in my analysis of their work that I did not pursue, and I hope to share with you some of the unfolding processual nature of work with living research participants, and the braiding of ethical, aesthetic, and intellectual challenges that arise from long-term relationships between ethnographers and their interlocutors. So I'm going to just introduce three of the kind of main characters in my research. Yanki Lemmer is the most commercially successful cantor among the participants in my study. He told me that among his friends growing up, they were into music, but not khazones. I was the only oddball. Being a fan of cantorial music was a marker of his nonconformity. Another singer, Yoel Cohn, connected his love of khazones to a period of disaffected youth when he was bored out of his mind and desperate for an aesthetic outlet that it could express his developing feeling world. Speaking about his cohort of young Hasidic Cantorial revivalists, he said, "That's part of what made us. We were all sort of artistic. We were deprived. We had no outlets. We had to focus inside. We had to become introspective in order to achieve any sort of artistic or creative outlet, any sort of creative climax." Shimmy Miller similarly described khazones as part of the emotional turbulence of a sensitive youth striving to define an adult identity. It's like it's part of the transformation. It's just part of the chronological order of things. You're a teen. You have all kinds of things on your mind. So I started getting into listening to khazones, mainly old chazonim. My initial research questions about pedagogy and patterns of transmission of musical knowledge alerted me to the fact that for the singers I was working with, cantorial music was not directly connected to the musical or liturgical norms of their community. As may come as a surprise to the broader public, the music most prevalent in the contemporary Hasidic world is a style of popular music that is, broadly speaking, appropriative of mainstream commercial music genres. Music is in fact an area of Hasidism, a religious community typified by its conservatism and separatism, that is permeable to the influence of contemporary society. Music that appropriates from mainstream commercial genres functions in the separatist Orthodox world as its own special form of boundary maintenance, letting in elements of the mainstream while at the same time creating a sonic landscape that is specific to Orthodoxy and heightens the sense of a separate world with its own rules of social life. And Orthodox pop music is not the main focus of my talk today, but perhaps in the Q&A, if that's something of interest to people, we can discuss that further. So what emerged from listening to Hasidic cantors tell stories about their musical lives was a jarring insight. Rather than a conservative musical movement geared towards maintaining the norms of a religious community, reviving khazones was an anti-conformist musical practice that offered singers an avenue for self-expression and the development of identities as artists in an aesthetically and formally complex domain. Before I continue, I'd like to play you a short clip of a cantorial kumsitz, a music-making party, that is distinctly on the margins and outside the institutions of religious authority, and that demonstrates some of the energy and talent in this musical community. So I'm just going to switch programs here. as I came to more intimately know this musical community, what I wanted to try to understand was what qualities inhere in the cantorial idiom that make it appropriate for the framing of a countercultural music movement in the present day. Trying to answer this question forced me to reevaluate some of my working understandings of the form and function of Jewish liturgical music of the quote-unquote cantorial golden age. Listening to present-day Hasidic cantors draws into question the received wisdom about the conservative qualities of this idiom. My perspective on the cantorate has been refocused on a narrative of contention over sacred authority driven by non-conforming artists. So I've come to understand early 20th century cantors as part of a transnational intellectual modernist movement that presented a stylized version of heritage and transformed the meaning of sacred music performance in response to the affordances of mass media, state violence, and migration. The radical genealogies of cantorial tradition and its reverberations in the present day are the primary focus of my first book, and this theme continues to inform my current archival research project, in which I am developing a cultural history of liturgical music as a form of popular culture in the early 20th century Yiddish-speaking Jewish American immigrant community. In my talk today, I will focus on some of the issues that came up in my research that I purposely sidelined while crafting the narrative of my thesis and eventual book. For reasons relating to the privacy of the artists, I mostly avoided discussing the dynamics of power in the Hasidic community and how they inflect the aesthetic choices of these singers. And I've come to question this choice. Across more than 8 years of my research working with cantors in the Hasidic Brooklyn community, I was struck by a recurring motif in the life story of multiple artists. Despite their deep investment in their music, the cantors expressed ambivalence about their own agency and typically described themselves as interpreters rather than as creators. In their discourse about their work, the cantors are strangely absent from their own story. They discuss their music as a form of imitation and embrace a self-defeating decline narrative that belies the fact that they are participants in a scene populated by young, talented, and energetic singers. So I'm intrigued by this juxtaposition of images. On the one hand, the singers appear to be seeking artistic agency and license to be creative people, and on the other, they disavow the possibility of success in this undertaking. In this talk, I will pursue the theme of aesthetic agency towards the goal of clarifying the careful balance of identities in being an artist and a Hasidic person, and the ethical implications of the attitude of the Hasidic world towards its intellectuals and artists. Through an ethnographic depiction of a painful incident in the life of one singer in the cantorial revivalist community, I hope to illuminate the vulnerability and the power of artists in working in non-institutional sites of cultural production. So as I describe in my book, Hasidic cantors self-initiate educational pathways, cultivate historically informed performance techniques, and painstakingly develop careers as artists through reference to the recordings of early 20th century cantors. The best singers excel in this area to an almost uncanny degree, recreating minute details of intonation and vocal gesture they have learned from century-old records. Yet this area of achievement is frequently discussed in terms of a lack of creative agency. Cantor Shimmy Miller has referred to the Hasidic cantorial scene as a gesisa, a term used in the Talmud to connote a deceptive burst of vitality shortly before death. At the same time, these singers are participants in a scene populated by young artists. Inequalities in the distribution of power in the Hasidic community creates palpable danger in pursuing a nonconformist aesthetic that can have real-life consequences. The skepticism of Hasidic singers in their community gives artists an incentive to disavow personal agency over their creative projects. The distance between fantasy and outcomes in the musical lives of Hasidic cantorial revivalists is a site of painful compromise, where paradoxical approaches to aesthetics are made visible. Although their work is marked by compromise and self-effacement, the music of these singers also opens up a set of possibilities. Their creativity lays the foundation for new kinds of sacred communal experience that fall outside of the remit of power holders in the hierarchy of Hasidic life. In the brave and vulnerable moments when they take power, Hasidic cantorial revivalists offer clues about how artists can claim authority over the construction of heritage. These marked moments of heterotopic artistic community generate new readings of history and portend potential future paths in which authority over religious experience is decentralized and expressive culture offers outlet for nonconforming identities. Intentional acts of self-effacement play a role in various forms of Jewish traditionalism, manifested in tendencies towards authorial pseudepigraphy in some canonical texts, and in the doctrine of tznius, or modesty, in public comportment. So more decisive in the careers of cantorial revivalists is the dynamic of power in the contemporary Hasidic community and the culture of chastisement towards nonconformity. Hasidic communities in Brooklyn today are explicitly organized around faith in the divine origin of Jewish law, a selective conception of traditional lifeways, and the authority of rabbinic leaders. This faith is visibly expressed through public displays of piety, ritual observance, sartorial conformity, communal foodways, the study of sacred texts, sharply segregated gender roles, and a communally disciplined approach to heterosexual family life. The social controls of the community can pose a danger to Hasidic intellectuals. As I argue in my book, khazones plays a role as a music of personal liberation, offering tools to imagine the possibilities of sacred art as a constructive path towards self-expression. But in my book, I intentionally downplay the social control aspect of Hasidic life, highlighting instead how creativity functions in non-liberal communities as a form of agency without resistance, to quote Saba Mahmoud. I suggest that Hasidic singers drawn to cantorial music stretch the boundaries of acceptable behavior towards cultural and aesthetic ends that are not geared towards an overthrow of authority or rupturing of their identities as Hasidic men. Since finishing my book, I've grown closer to some of my research respondents and have come to see that my original celebratory view of their achievements partially obscures some of the challenges that they face. This talk offers a complementary, partially contradictory view that acknowledges more fully the role of communal mechanisms of power in limiting the self-authoring potentials of Hasidic cantors. Although pursuing khazones falls outside of the norms of the community, I have found that the outcome of leaving is by far the exception among Hasidic cantors. And I'm going to introduce the term OTD, or off the derech, which is a term used to describe people who have left, who were born into the Hasidic community and left. So even among the handful of OTD cantors, and there are more than one, khazones is a force holding them more firmly in the realm of Jewish traditionalism rather than a contributing factor pushing them out. Khazones is an effective and cultural lever that connects Hasidic nonconformists to their birth community, in part due to the power of the cantorial revival subculture of like-minded aesthetic seekers. Rabbinic elites and other power holders in Hasidic Brooklyn have for the most part rejected or ignored this talented and visible set of performers within the community, foregoing the possibility of domesticating their work into the normative structures of Hasidic life. So as Cantor Yankee Lemmer described it to me, he imagines the Beltz Rebbe, this gentleman here, the leader of his birth community, as holding an attitude towards him of a love-hate relationship. He can't approve of what I do, singing for mixed-gender crowds, that kind of thing. Despite vertical rejection, cantorial revivalists receive a focused and insightful horizontal affirmation from their small community. For Hasidic singers, cantorial performance is both a site of exploration beyond the conservative boundaries of their birth community and a performance of traditionalism, albeit employing forms of self-expression that are ethically ambiguous from the perspective of rabbinic authority. This is in part because cantorial music offers singers opportunity to perform outside of the community, but also because its sounds make reference to a Jewish cultural moment that was expansive in its aesthetic explorations, and in which musicians claimed authority as arbiters of popular ritual experience. As such, engaging in cantorial revival poses dangers for the members of this artistic group. And yet, cantorial revival is expressive of a subtle optimism about the possibility of creating a future in which the unique educational affordances of Hasidic education and lifeways are rendered compatible with non-conforming expressive practices. So in the following story, in which khazones played a central role, a momentary glimpse comes into view of how this futurity might be actualized in the space of ritual. Before I proceed with this ethnographic episode, I offer warning that the story I have to tell here is a tragic one, as perhaps is appropriate for this tangled and violent moment in Jewish history. My offering with this essay is intended to provide some sense of the healing potentials that only artists can provide, but with the heavy knowledge that the blessing they offer the world cannot be brought into view without the ratification of a political elite that does not seem to be able to shake its addiction to power and violence. As those of you who have conducted long-term ethnographic projects know, there is no natural ending to the study of human lives. Even death is a heightening in the flow of community and experience. All points of conclusion are arbitrary. After I, quote unquote, finished my research with Hasidic cantors, my relationships with my research participants continued to grow and deepen. My role in the music community expanded as I became a regular in the choir of elder Hasidic cantor Ben Zion Miller and produced concerts with cantors in New York and in Poland. A record of the cantors that I produced was featured on National Public Radio. I stayed involved, after the supposed ending. One of the participants in my research, Yoel Cohen, has continued to play an especially important role in my life as a friend and frequent collaborator, both because of his enormous talent and in part because of his identity as an OTD person. As a former member of the Hasidic community, Yoel faces many challenges to his cultivation of a cantorial career, and I have striven to be of service to him as a friend and musical advisor. In May of 2023, Yoel Cohen's teenage daughter was killed in a traffic accident, a tragedy no one should have to experience. So I do not introduce this detail lightly. I've chosen deliberately and with Yoel's encouragement to tell something of his story because this awful occurrence drew into focus the weight Yoel shoulders as an outsider in the place of his own birth and reveals some of the raw dynamics of power in the Hasidic world. This story exposes inflexibility and troubling callousness in the treatment of a grieving father and testifies to the weight of the choices Hasidic people must make in seeking agency in the face of a rigid social order. So I heard the news from a mutual friend, Yanki Lemmer. The next morning, I made the 2-hour drive from Brooklyn to Lakewood, New Jersey, where Yoel's ex-wife lives, and found the funeral already in progress. As their name suggests, the Cohen family are Kohanim, descendants of the priestly caste of ancient Israel. According to traditional Jewish law, Kohanim are not allowed to come in contact with a dead body, with an exception made for next of kin. Yoel's father, Meyer Baruch, was not in the chapel where the casket was laid out for his granddaughter, nor were any other male members of Yoel's immediate family. The funeral home had a designated area for Kohanim directly outside the chapel. As I entered the chapel, Meyer Baruch, a famed prayer leader himself and singer in the Satmar Hasidic community, stood outside, delivering a eulogy for his granddaughter through a wireless microphone that was broadcast into the main space. He stood outside. His voice shook, breaking frequently into sobs. His eulogy was reminiscent of his prayer leading, which also employs frequent crying-like sounds that give signification and emotional center to his interpretation of the sacred texts. As is normative in Hasidic public gatherings, men and women were seated separately with a high partition separating the genders. In Satmar synagogues, gender segregation can render women almost invisible, but at the funeral, women were hardly silent or removed from the experience. Rather, the ebb and flow of sounds of weeping from the women's section was unavoidable. The interchange of women wailing and the male speakers eulogizing the dead child was the distinctive and haunting soundscape of the funeral. I entered the funeral hall expecting to find Yoel surrounded by family and community members. I was taken aback to see him sitting in the front right-hand corner of the men's section with just 2 friends, both OTD men, and all of the pews behind him completely empty. In contrast, the main rows of pews were completely filled with men from the community. His isolation and ostracization was visually and spatially marked in an unmistakable and vertigo-inducing spotlight of empty space. I went and sat down with Yoel and his friends, feeling chilled by this surgical example of shunning. Yanki Lemmer came and sat with us, the only chassid rounding out the small and intimate group of supporters who sat arrayed with Yoel against a sea of isolation. A few speakers later, Yoel's former brother-in-law got up and gave a eulogy in which he made a thinly veiled accusation that Yoel's rejection of religion was the cause of his daughter's death. Yoel sat with his expression unchanged, aware of what was being said, but seemingly transported beyond a level where insults could harm him. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The level of disregard for human decency was destabilizing. I don't think I've ever seen a human being publicly treated in a more demeaning fashion, and yet the funeral proceeded as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Shortly after, it was Yoel's turn to speak. He spoke of how strong his daughter had been, and how the experience of seeing how the community treats so-called broken homes taught her to become even more compassionate to others. Unlike all of the other eulogies, which had been delivered in Yiddish, Yoel spoke in English, the language he had used to communicate with his daughter. Yoel's voice broke repeatedly while he was talking, and with each sob, the room shook with sympathetic vibrations from the women's section, a convulsing cacophony of cries and howls. The level of uninhibited public expression of grief was fearful and cathartic. The link between the stylized, expressive components of cantorial performance and public display of women's emotion was made audible in a most palpable manner here, with the voices of cantors juxtaposed with the sound of women's lament. 2 days later, I attended Shiva at Yoel's parents' house in Williamsburg. Shiva is a ritual period of mourning. When I entered the ground floor of their brownstone, I found Yoel and Meyer Baruch seated in an all-male circle of friends and relatives, some of whom were familiar to me from the cantorial revival scene. In addition to Hasidic Cantorial insiders, an unusual visitor was in attendance, paying his condolences to the Cohns. It was Jackie Mendelson, an elder of the liberal movement cantorial scene, and a veteran instructor at the Hebrew Union College Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music. Mendelson is famed as a point of connection to the past through his personal relationship with stars of the gramophone era. I had introduced Jackie to Yoel some years back, and they have stayed in touch in the intervening years. Mendelson and Meyer Baruch Cohn sat side by side and took turns singing old cantorial recitatives. Meyer Baruch sang Haneshama Lach, as recorded by Zabel Kvartin in 1927. In the piece, the words, "The soul is yours, the body is yours," repeat over and over, resulting in an accretion of energy and pathos. And I will play a video that circulated online of Jackie Mendelson singing at this event. There was a palpable excitement among the young Hasidic singers in the room around Mendelssohn's performance. His virtuosity and star aura animated the listeners, who commented audibly on his beautifully executed coloraturas and bravura high-register passages. The responses to the performances by the two cantorial elders alternated between the expected forms of audience engagement at a cantorial kumsitz, heads nodding in concentration, faces breaking out in broad smiles at brilliant musical effects, remarks of shekoyach, the Yiddish word for congratulations, after the end of pieces, a few moments of applause. The music also elicited another kind of response that is commonly associated with cantorial singing, that is the shedding of tears. Here in this house of mourning, tears were not only a signifier of aesthetic impact. Here in this room, the performance of emotional extremes that is so closely linked with the musicality of cantors functioned differently. The sound of tears was more than ritualized sound. It was a concrete presence, referencing an experience of overpowering loss. And here in this house of mourning, khazones showed its special power to highlight the internal diversity of the Jewish community. The aesthetic, anti-normative sound world of khazones is capable of convening collectives that strain the boundaries of what might be considered possible. In this house of mourning, comfort and community was created through the musical bonding of a devout elder Satmar Chassid and a leader in the Reform Jewish community, both of whom were offering care to a younger man who had rejected Hasidic Judaism. The power of cantorial music to convene Jewish publics has been greatly reduced since its heyday in the early 20th century. But when it is activated, the music cuts across lines of identity and functions as a form of ritual encounter presided over by artists, not rabbinic authorities. The details of Yoel's story points to the role music and sound play as mediating forces that push back against boundaries of identity. In the midst of a scene of extreme distress and emotional abuse, khazones played a signal role as a sound that draws together disparate strands of Jewish lives, lived in seemingly incompatible cultural spheres, and that offered some momentary glimpse of unity and decency that seemed to elude power holders in the community that had gathered to mourn the loss of a child. The sites of cantorial revival, like the Shiva singing session I described above, are often domestic and private. The cantorial kumsitz, or music-making party, is a group project of heritage maintenance and the cultivation of spiritual affect. They are in many ways the opposite of the public displays of Hasidic spirituality, which tend towards mass demonstrations. Hasidic public displays of community are characterized by extremely loud volume, with music played through blaring PA systems and the highly visible presence of the Rebbe or other dignitaries of the elite establishment. The contrasts between these worlds of sound are demonstrative of contrasting approaches to the experience of aesthetics and the ethical exercise of spiritual authority. In the years since I completed my initial research, I've grown in my admiration for the cantors, and at the same time, I've grown more sanguine in my assessment of the role of power in the Hasidic birth communities. I've come closer to seeing why the lead voices of this art movement believe that their work is futile. The indefinitely delayed future of the Hasidic Cantorial revival movement is a product of an internalized sense of the limits of personal autonomy and the rigors of body and spirit that await those who push too hard at the boundaries of their social worlds. If Hasidic Cantorial revival has the potential to build countercultural spaces using the tools of aesthetics and heritage, it will demand some kind of act of revolutionary bravery to build new public spaces where the work can be done. The Hasidic community cultivates a depth of sensitivity to Jewish sources of heritage, but at the same time, it forecloses many opportunities to put this knowledge and feeling to use. This is because the community is unbending in its commitment to a monoculture. Anyone conversant with the Hasidic community of Brooklyn is aware that there is tremendous internal diversity and that there is a brave and pulsing community of artists and intellectuals at work there. The question that remains unanswered is how and when the energies of the community's artists will be unfettered and given public space to breathe, and if it is even possible for such a future to be imagined without triggering the punitive powers of the community in its dealings with those who have strayed past the boundaries on self-authoring and freedom. Okay, thank you all so much. Okay.
Hi, thank you. This was an incredible and really moving talk. I want to ask about this as a story about gender. I was struck when you put the word sneas up on the board that, I have only ever heard that word used about women, and particularly about, like women's clothing. And I think those of us who work on gender often end up talking about women, but there's a really interesting counter to societies that are often very male dominated, which is the power and enforcement that goes into male comportment. And so I'm just wondering what you think this community, and in particular, episodes like the one that you narrated, can tell us about the experience of gendered control that is applied to men.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. It's a really important one, and this is a project about the construction of masculinity, certainly. And I would say that's one of the central themes in the research that emerged. And Tznia is the dominant discourse in talking about women in Orthodox separatist communities. But Tznia as a cultural rubric also applies to men, right? I mean, if you think about how we see Hasidic men, we see them in a very specific way, right? There's the body also needs to be completely covered, and the idea about personal comportment is also highly disciplined and controlled. And in terms of thinking about the affordances of what is possible, how can one articulate a sense of personal control over intellectual discourses or aesthetic discourses from your gendered subjectivity is right. So there's some push and pull but it's highly skepticized and policed, right? And so for women and men, the performance of gender is a controlling script that does a lot of harm. I think it basically is, but also offers affordances, right? And I have a colleague who works on women's music in the community, and we're doing a bunch of presentations together. We're kind of talking about these. But it's these as two sides of a coin. But I think that there's a lot of slippage as well, right? That the male cantorial voice is in some way a masculine performance of femininity, right? There's a sense that cantorials have somehow appropriated women's emotionalism into their performance of prayer, right? And that's not a new thing, right? That's going back to the earliest recordings we have of cantors and descriptions of cantors, from written sources before that. So the idea that a cantor is in some way a gendered body, and a body that is in some ways feminized, is part of the discourse around cantors, and is also part of the problematics of being a cantor or performer of khazones in the contemporary Hasidic community, which has very unbending gender ideologies. It's usually articulated more in fears about some kind of sexual permissiveness, right? That the cantors are seen as being eroticized bodies, right? And that their performances, because if they're performing outside of the community, they're performing for audiences that have mixed genders, right? And that's the official discourse about why it's bad, but it touches upon that is code for a lot of different, I would say, a lot of different issues around gender and power. But there's a lot more to say about that, and thank you for that. Yeah.
Wonderful talk, and I admit, like, having sort of watched you read, some of your initial texts about the beginning of the 20th century and read them with you, and sort of watched your project develop, I'm so fascinated by it, and it's fascinating to see your own analysis develop over time. I'm really like taken by this this explanation of how you wrote the book in kind of one set of questions, and then you finished the book, and now you're sort of going back to this material and these people with a slightly different set of questions, different concerns that you had sort of deliberately turned away from in writing the book at first. And you explain your shift as having to do with your own increasing kind of intimacy with your subjects, your continuing engagement with them, and you also describe it as emerging from specific events in the lives of your interlocutors, such as Yoel Cohen. And I'm wondering whether there's also another story that might be about kind of shifting scholarly expectations or paradigms. I always feel like we see things, we see our material through ourselves, and we see them through everyone else. Mm-hmm. And are we all shifting? Is Jewish studies shifting? Is musicology shifting? You're in multiple fields. Yeah. Do you feel like you're responding to some larger kind of changing of intellectual paradigms that's been happening around you, or do you feel like it's really about you and Yoel and this sort of specific kind of interpersonal set of things happening on a smaller scale?
I mean, that's a very perceptive and wonderful question, Gabriella, and in some ways maybe you would be in a better position to answer that than I would, because I'm so deep in it. But I would say that yes. I mean, I was trying to answer educational questions in my thesis research, because I was in the School of Education. I mean, that was my starting project, and that shaped the trajectory. And looking at how there's a historical trajectory of how the music has shifted in terms of what it means and how it's taught, and that these figures are somehow subverting the normative story about khazones, and in some ways reclaiming or coming to a deeper understanding of this original archival material. So that's sort of the story of the book. And then the gender piece was underdeveloped in the book, right? And also it's an all male cohort of artists that I write about, but there are women involved in the cantorial revival scene. So I mean, it's a tricky question, right? There's like, first of all, there's the issue about writing about the construction of gender for the artists, the male artists, and then there's another issue of talking about women in the Hasidic community and where they sit in relationship to cantorial music as consumers of the music and as performers of it. So I'm working on a article now about a woman who's a performer of khazones, who's a very interesting, and her work is very fecund. There's lots to say about it. But she's OTD, right? And there are a few OTD women who are involved in the scene, and they're quite marginalized, right? They're not in these parties, right? Because the characteristic of the party is that it's on the fringe of the community, but it is in the house of a man who lives in Williamsburg and is a Hasidic man. So that next step of breaking the gender wall in the Orthodox cantorial community is one that I wear different hats, right? So like as a scholar, I'm writing about it and trying to figure out what's happening, and then as a concert producer and musical collaborator, I work with women cantors a lot, So I'm trying to see if what slippage is possible, in terms of breaking down some of these boundaries.
Something that interests me is not just. I mean, it's interesting to think about gender, and I remember, there were some women cantors in the Golden Age also, right?
Yes, well,
among those recordings, right? So super cool. Yeah. But I guess what I'm really wondering is like this sort of tone. Like there's a shift in tone, right? Your book is more maybe
more optimistic,
upbeat, right? And then like this is like in a minor key, this stuff. And is there a general shift in tone that's happening around you that you're responding to? That's not only what you pay attention to, like gender or not gender, but the kind of mood.
It's difficult moments.
It's a leading question.
No. I mean, I think it's I think about that more. Okay. But I would say that it's not a difficult moment in life or in history to be optimistic, right? I would say that's a fair statement to make.
Oh, and then how do scholars respond?
I mean, the answers to social ills are not impossible, and they're not like horrifying, impossible, mysteries that you have to kill yourself to find. They're quite on some level they're quite obvious, right? Don't treat people in a horrible way. Don't kill people. It's like, but yet getting there is you're up against mountains of history, right? So it's I'm trying to unpack them and talk about them in a reasoned way. I think is an important part of our work. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm curious if you could say more about your own positionality and how others responded to you as someone who did not present as a member of the community, and how that positionality maybe opened some insights for you and foreclosed other insights.
Yeah, I mean, I am a musician and I'm from a cantorial family. So that helped a lot in terms of the initial beginnings of the project, that the cantors who I was working with all knew my grandfather's recordings, and so that opened the conversations very easily. And also, it's not that hard to do research with Hasidic people, I would say. Right? I mean, people think it's a lot harder than it is, I would say. Like everybody's bilingual. The number of people who actually really don't speak any English is very small. Even Meyer Baruch, whose English is not amazing, we can communicate. I mean, anyway, I know Yiddish somewhat to some extent. So like if he's code switching between English and Yiddish, I can follow what's going on. But none of the research participants needed to speak in Yiddish. Like it was completely fine for them to speak in English. So my positionality in terms of not being an outsider of the community, I think I went in on some level with a kind of maybe a bit of a defensiveness about my interlocutors. I was like, they can be artists, because of who they are. It doesn't mean that it's not possible for them to express, this opacity. This is Anita has a wonderful article about the right to opacity, drawing on glissant, and it was definitely a major theme in what I was writing about. And then, but at the same time, I think you also have to be real and accept, and look at the reality of how hard their lives are, And I remember having a conversation with someone who's a cantor in one of the liberal movements, and he was asking me if working with Hasidim has influenced me to become more religious, and which is a funny question. But my reaction was very, kind of knee-jerk. It was like, they know how hard it is. They would never encourage anybody to become more, So it's, for them, I think, it's different. I mean, each person has a different story about, and the way they would respond to my positionality was different in each case. But, it's, in terms of either feeling that they needed to defend their identity versus looking at it as an opportunity to be able to admit how difficult what they do is, and who they are.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah. My heart is so beating from just how beautiful this was, and I just want to thank you for sharing these intimate videos with us that are from your kind of personal experience. I know that pulling of the veil back from my own work, sometimes you're conflicted about it. So I just wanted to say thank you, first of all. So many things that I will hopefully have a chance to talk to you about another time. But one thing that struck me so much about these videos is the role that affect plays in sort of maintaining these private spaces and in constructing these kind of private, intimate spaces of mourning, or if not mourning, of kind of construction of identity. And then you were talking about this futurity of this kind of generation of maybe OTD folks who are trying to sort of renegotiate heritage and renegotiate identity. And it got me thinking about heritage as, this is a bad way of thinking of things, but is it good or bad? Mm-hmm. Because heritage can be this thing that sort of bogs us down, right, in the past, and all these kind of movements of futurism sort of to try to reimagine that are responding to that. And I guess what I'm wondering about is, because of this private and public kind of divide, it got me thinking about audience and who these artists are trying to, maybe part of it is about trying to create a new audience for this renegotiated form of heritage that sort of allows for a kind of a new identity, a new Jewish Hasidic identity. And so I guess that's the question, is how are they, sort of thinking about their own art as a sort of self-representing ethnography, a phrase that we both like to use. How are they thinking of that, and how are they using it to go through that process of negotiation? And that might be too broad of a question for now.
Yeah, it's a great question. So much came up from that, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it because there were a bunch of different parts, and I want to think about it. But in terms of this kind of so let's see, you talked about audiences and about the role of autoethnography, I think, and I wasn't exactly sure about the connection between the two, but I could address them somewhat separately, maybe, and maybe some kind of connection will come up. In terms of the autoethnography component, all of the Hasidic cantors talk about how being Hasidic is a kind of a controlling part of the narrative. This, we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't Hasidic. Mm-hmm. And yet, most Hasidic people don't know what they're talking about, right? So there's something that's confusing about this, right? Mm-hmm. What you learn as a Hasidic person involves certain kinds of textual knowledge, languages, the kind of paralinguistic aspects of the Yiddish language that are very important for khazones, for the older music, and they are in touch with these things in a way that gives them an incredible advantage to learn about it, and yet no one is ever teaching them. They have to find it on their own, and the reason they know about it is because of YouTube, right? And they're able to get at it through the internet, just like other people who are interested in music, a kind of niche musical movements. So the ethnographic element cuts in different ways. Their Hasidism gives them tools, but also holds them back from being able to use them. And then, right, because of this, because of the audience's element, right? So there is an audience for khazones in the Hasidic community in a very, very niche avenues. Right, there are mass meetings of the community at which there are a handful of cantors who get hired to sing at these, to do they'll do one piece, right? And so that creates a sense that this music exists and people know what it is, but on a very limited scale. And there are a few superstars, so people who tour internationally, and the guys who I highlighted their stories are like on the cusp of that. It's unclear whether or not they can break into it, or whether or not that market will continue to exist. Or then there's the other audience, which is the affect community, and this is with people who are in a variety of ways on the margins. And mostly just because they're unusual people, right? They don't fit in exactly, right? And the cantors themselves are sort of like that as well, right? And yet they are able to express something about what it means to be Hasidic, and able to articulate an idea about Jewishness being able to be communicated through an art form that is seen as being not exactly elitist. I'm just kind of struggling to find the language around an elevated aesthetic, right? That this is an avenue towards doing something which is not the same as our pop music, right? Because the pop music is to be blunt, it's a product of great ignorance, right? There's no musical education in the community, so when people go to try to make new music, they do covers of whatever is on the mainstream commercial radio, right? So this is an avenue that allows people to use their Jewish educations to create an elevated aesthetic form, and yet they have to be very resourceful to figure it out, because it's not really easier to become a performer of this old style than it is to, say, become an opera singer. I mean, it's very sort of similar in a way. So the ethnographic piece is a bit, it cuts in different directions.
So in both of the videos, nobody was ever singing alone. There was always some kind of hum from the other men in the room. And I'm wondering in both instances, it's clearly both performance and prayer at the same time. Maybe in the Shiva one, it's
actually they were both performance. They were not.
Right.
I mean, because prayer means something very specific. There's the 3 times a
Right,
day,
sure,
and
sure.
so.
But there's some. The function of it feels different. Yeah, it was prayerful, right? Maybe different from that same melody being sung on a stage in front of a mixed audience, right? I guess I'm wondering if in those sort of more strict performance venues, if there's also kind of a collective singing along thing that happens from the audience, or if it's truly a solo act where it's like watching an opera.
It's more the latter. So, but it would be great if it was the former. Right. I mean, I think that there's a kind of there's a mismatch between how cantorial concerts are put on and how the music, exists in its sources, and that's sort of goes back to the early 20th century phenomenon of the recordings, which are stylized and textualized. Right, there's just a little piece of the liturgy is taken out and turned into kind of almost like an opera aria. Right, so it's quite different from what cantorial performance sounds like in synagogue, and that is part of the grammar of the style. I mean, it's very musically, it's a very interesting part, right? Because the famous classic pieces that people perform are from these records. And the sound of what it's like to hear an expert khazan leading a prayer service is related but very different, right? And so that's then you get into this other area of like the most important cantorial concerts used to be prayer performances, right? So where 1,000 people would come together on a Shabbos morning and listen to a cantor sing, and the people in the pews are not silent at all, right? They are davening. They're saying presumably many of them are actually saying the same words that the cantor is saying at the same time, So there's this kind of like heterophonic, kind of quality to the musical performance. And on bootlegs that people made, this is something else that I'm very interested in, is bootleg recordings that people made, kind of secret, someone have a tape recorder in their jacket pocket. And that sound in comparison to the sound of the commercial recordings that are in this kind of staged, performative style, and that dichotomy lingers on into the present in terms of how the music is presented. But the cantors, they know that it's a big problem because they can do concerts. There are concerts. They're not that many, and it's not people are not able to make a living from it. The kind of the pre-World War II model for a cantorial career was a mix of concerts and leading services, and leading services is very infrequent, right? To do a cantorial prayer leading where someone is and doing this kind of improvisatory. I mean, it was there's one old guy in Brooklyn, and unfortunately his health is not so good, so he's basically stopped. Who does this earlier style of cantorial prayer leading, and there are some younger artists who could do it, but it's, again, they'd have to figure out some place to do it on their own, right? No synagogue is going to hire them to do it. So it's a serious challenge.
We have time for one more question.
I have one, and this partly, I think, maybe motivated by something you were saying, Gabriella, but it struck me that growing up, right, the Hasidic, like there was like this era of mysticism around what goes up in these tiny communities in the past, maybe like decade. Then it seems like there's like a lot of interest in what's going. There's now like a Haredi working group at UCLA, and then oh my God, the Netflix shows are just so. What do you even do with all of them? So I was wondering, like, and then you mentioned at one point, people watching videos on YouTube. So like, how has like, the ability to connect or maybe learn, both like outsiders looking in, but then also people within these communities connecting across different communities in different spaces, but kind of similar religious practices, like how that kind of factors into what you're seeing with this revival. I don't know if that made any sense.
No, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's a few different parts of it. One is the kind of representation of Hasidim in popular culture, which is very big. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly new though, because people have always been kind of fascinated by separatist religious movements, right? But it's true that it's highly visible, right? Especially in the last few years because of the Netflix shows and documentaries. And in part, that's because the Hasidic community is demographically just growing a lot, right? I mean, the rest of the world is kind of contracting, but Hasidic community is growing. So it is beginning to, the idea that, they're on the fringe, there's that little thing over there in the corner, that's becoming less tenable, really. I think that the Jewish community is increasingly consists of separatist orthodoxy, and so it's important, and it's going to keep that unless something changes radically. That's going to be a bigger and bigger part of the story of American Jewish life over the course of the next decades to come. And then the other part about the internet. Oh yeah. I mean, this thing that I'm writing about, the Hasidic Cantorial revival, only exists because of the internet. Right? It's not to say that there was no access to this music before, but there were one or two shops, where they carried anthologies of reissues of old records, and serious music heads would go to these places to buy records. But now it's really easy. You have it in your pocket, and it's everyone has access to it. And so the the internet is used for multiple elements, for learning, for sharing your own work. People can make bootlegs of themselves doing recordings, and then share them online, and that happens all the time. I mean, that's not some fringe thing. There's WhatsApp is very popular and for everybody, but in the Hasidic community, it's a major part of how people communicate with each other. And there are multiple khazones WhatsApp groups where people share recordings.
So for those of you who don't know, Jeremiah will be performing this evening as part of his duo, Gordon Lockwood, at 5 o'clock at the Faculty Club. Not khazones.
No, it's we're going to do a kind of like a recital of Yiddish songs, and it's the Clara Sumpf lecture usually has two parts, right? The English and the Yiddish, and so I'm going to be giving the Yiddish component as a concert, and playing with my dear friend Ricky Gordon, who's a very great jazz drummer, who's going to be playing with me, and I hope you all can make it. It's going to.
Thanks, Jeremiah. We'll see you tonight.
Thank you all.